Good afternoon. It's Sunday afternoon in the backyard of the encouraging word, enjoying the weather. I want to read to you today from Luke chapter 15. Luke 15 has three stories in it. One is about a man who loses one sheep. The other is about a woman who loses one piece of silver. And the third story is the most popular one, is a man who lost one of his two sons. And we call it the story of the prodigal son. The word prodigal means wasteful, lavish, luxuriant, someone who spends money recklessly. And we'll see how that's the truth with this one son. The story chapter 15, starts out with a man who has 100 sheep and he loses one, and he searches diligently until he finds that one sheep. And when he finds the sheep, he causes a great party to be held, and everyone is called in to rejoice over the one sheep that was found. A few verses later, there's a story about a woman, and this probably happened in this fashion. She had a necklace or a bracelet that had 10 pieces of silver on it. One of them was lost. She panicked. She did what most people would do and stop everything and look for it. She found it. She too had a party and called everyone and rejoiced over the one piece of silver that was found. Chapter 15 goes on to talk about a man who had two sons, and they lived on apparently a rather large estate. And the younger son one day came to his father after dreaming about having his inheritance early and spending money and going to distant lands, demanded of his father his share of the inheritance. At that time, this was unheard of. The son was probably entitled to a series of disciplinary measures to remind him he cannot have his inheritance prior to the death of the father. But nevertheless, Dad, being who he was, gave the son his share. At the time, the law at the time, the custom was that the first son got double portion, and that would mean the younger son got half of that. So let's do the math. He got 1/3 of the estate, and the other son would have been entitled to 2/3 of the estate. And we know about the story about the son who takes his money and runs off, but we also have to realize that the father gave both sons their inheritance. Most people don't catch this. In verse 12, it said the younger son said to his father, "Give me the portion of goods that falleth to me," and he divided unto them his living. So both sons were giving his inheritance. The father essentially owned nothing at that point. And so the younger son took his share and went off to a distant country. He did not invest his money. He spent it foolishly, hence the term prodigal. Prodigal does not refer to the son who comes home with his hat in his hand. It refers to a son who spent all that he had foolishly. We see that in verse 14, it says that he spent all that he had, and right after that money was gone, a famine came over the land that he was in. Now, later on in verse 30, his older brother is telling his father that his younger brother, the one that went off, spent his money on foolish living and harlot. So he was essentially drinking and hanging around with prostitutes and spent his money foolishly. verse 13 says that not many days after he left, when he had spent all his money with riotous living, a famine arose in the land. So this actually says that in a few short days he spent quite a legacy that was left to him, all of his inheritance. He spent it on riotous living. When you have money, you have lots of friends. When you have no money, you have no friends. So he remembered, the son remembered, he was thinking about the good times back home. He remembered how generous his father was, and that his generous gave his own servants so much to eat that they had plenty of food for themselves all the time. The younger son looked around and realized that he was a fool, that he had spent all his money, that he had sinned before God and his father, and had recklessly separated himself from the inheritance, the wealth that he had just days before. He thought about what to do, and he came up with a plan. He says, I'm going to go home. He says, this is what I'm going to do. He rehearsed what he was going to say to his father. He says, I'm going to go home to my father. Number one. Number two. These are in verses 18, 19, and 20. I'm going to go home to my father. I will say to him, I have sinned against you in heaven. The next thing he planned on saying was, I am not worthy to be your son. And in verse 19 he says, and then I'm going to tell my dad, I'm not worthy to be your son again. Please just let me be one of your servants. Let me be one of the servants that you have so generously cared for and have given them much to eat. Previously, the son was feeding pigs in this distant country. He was forced to almost eat the very food that the people who he was living with, were given to the pigs. He came home destitute. It would have been custom for the father to have greeted him out of town and chastised him, condemned him, whipped him, done something to remove the shame that the family would have sustained as a result of the son having left to begin with. But this dad didn't do that. This dad was not angry. He was not anxious to condemn his son. He was not anxious to tell him all the things he had done wrong. The father was silent. And so the story goes on in verse 20, and when he arose, he got up, he left that country, he came home. He started walking up this road. If you can imagine just this country, this home at the end of a dirty road, a dusty road, and the father was sitting on the front porch. This is the vision I have. And as he looked out in his old eyes, he saw someone that looked familiar. And then he looked closer and closer, and he could tell by the way the young boy moved and walked that it was his son. So as the son approached the dad, his father had compassion for his younger son, and the young boy fell on his father's neck. He just completely surrendered and fell on his neck and began weeping. And then he began his rehearsed scenario, what he was going to tell his dad. He had rehearsed this. He had rehearsed the very words. So he said, number one, he says, I will go home. And he went home. Number two, in verse 21, he says to the father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and I am no more worthy to be called the son. So he went home. He said, I've sinned. I'm not worthy to be your son. The next thing he was going to say, he was supposed to say that he had rehearsed is, please let me be just a servant. I'm not asking to come back home and be your son. Just let me be a servant. At that time, the father told his servants, go get his robe, go get a ring, and go put shoes on his feet. My son, who was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found, and they began to be merry. So this story is not about a son who comes home. It's more about a father who had every right to be anxious and to condemn his son and to criticize him and to bemoan his actions and to complain about the finances. But he did none of that. In John chapter 8, the woman is caught in adultery is brought to Jesus. And the Pharisees said, the law says we should stone this woman. What are you going to do? And Jesus said to them, whoever is without sins may cast the first stone. They all got up and left. He asked the woman, he said, where are the men that have condemned you? And she said, they were all gone. And they said, well, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. So this is the story of what we call the prodigal son. There is joy in heaven over one sinner that repents. Jesus doesn't need 1,000 people to be saved in one day, one event, one church, one concert to be excited. He is excited, and there is joy in the angels of heaven over one sinner that repents. And this was that day. So remember, if you are the son and you need to go home and apologize, read this lesson, ascertain from it what you need to do. And if you're the dad and you have people coming to you that are going to be apologizing for things that they have done in the past that have hurt your feelings or harmed you, remember this story and read it before you respond. So that's it. That is Luke chapter 15. God bless you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. This is Philip Lynch, the encouraging word, May 1st, 2022. Thank you.